Hi, Govan. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video, I want to talk about a really interesting thing that comes up in The Hobbit and almost really never comes up again, and that's the topic of skin changers. There's several things in The Hobbit, of course, that get brought up that are very fairy tale-like that in the Lord of the Rings we kind of just ignore because we've changed the nature of the story. We've got the stone mountains and the stone giants in the Misty Mountains. We've got, you know, wereworms that get mentioned by Bilbo in his comments to the dwarves, or maybe it's in his own head. I forget which exactly. But Beorn is a skin changer, and that seems really interesting because we don't get the idea that that's like a normal thing in Middle Earth, and yet how do they come about? So I want to explore a couple different possible explanations for the origin of Beorn and skin changers in general and see what seems to make the most sense. So let's take a look. So what little we know about Beorn is mostly told to us by Gandalf as they're approaching his house in The Hobbit, and he mostly tells us pretty much that he's a skin changer. He changes into a giant bear, and he mentions the fact that he's under no enchantment but his own in response to the dwarves asking if he's cursed or something like that. And this really doesn't tell us a whole lot. And in the movie, The Hobbit, the Peter Jackson trilogy, we get this idea that Beorn used to have a lot of people like him, and they were enslaved by orcs or whatever, and then he's the only one left. This backstory is not really in the book at all, and we don't really know much about Beorn's history, and we don't know how common skin changers were prior to this point in the story. So we don't have a whole lot to go on as far as figuring out what he might be. However, we do have a lot of information from the Silmarillion, the Lord of the Rings, that could help tie in a few ideas that might lead to some idea of what he might be and where his abilities might come from. And not only in the major published Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings, but also some of his later writings that get published in the History of Middle-earth, we get some additional hints at things that might have happened. So, for example, one thing we do know about Tolkien's world is that even if you're not a Maya or something like that, you can be a human sorcerer. What exactly that means is not 100% clear because Tolkien never goes into really hard magic, in a sense. He doesn't get into the idea of explaining how magic works or how you can learn magic as a human or anything like that. We get some ideas of what he means by elf magic, meaning elves are more in tune with nature and they can do things from their own natural abilities that seem like magic to mortals, but aren't really magic. And we get this from Galadriel's comment that, when she tells Sam that the mirror of Galadriel is what you might call elf magic, though I don't know what you mean by the term because you apply the same word to the deceits of the enemy. So she sees what she does and what Sauron does as distinct categories. So what human sorcerers do is really kind of left up in the air. I mean, even what magic Gandalf and the other wizards do is a little bit vague, and it's a very soft magic system. But we do get the idea, at least from comments about humans and sorcery, that certainly there are humans who do something like magic. And it's interesting too, because the word sorcerer almost invariably gets applied in Tolkien to evil magic, black magic. Wizards are good guys and they can do magic, but every time we get a reference to a sorcerer, it's almost always bad guys. So, for example, the Witch King is referred to as, he was a sorcerer as well as, then he got turned into a Nazgul. So we've got hints like this, that there are abilities that humans can have to learn something like magic, whatever that is. So one possibility is that Beorn and any other people like him who do similar things are quite simply, as Gandalf says, enchanting themselves. They're putting themselves under an enchantment, and that's why he can change shape into a giant bear. Is that really what's going on? Maybe. We don't really get any kind of clue that Beorn is a magic wielding type of person. we get the idea almost that it's more inherent. And so when Gandalf says he's under no enchantment but his own, I don't necessarily take that as he's literally casting magic on himself so much as the thing that he's doing is not something that somebody else did to him. It's native to himself. I don't think he's meaning he's literally casting spells on himself to do what he does. I think that's really more just a response to the dwarves being, whatever magic is in him, it's his, not somebody else's. So I'm not convinced by the idea that he would be, just somebody who learned magic and by doing so figured out how to change shape. It's possible, but I'm not really a fan of that theory because it doesn't really seem to fit the feel of who Beorn is. If we don't consider Beorn a human magic wielder in some sense, then what's the other option? And the only other option that I can think of is that in some way he is the descendant of something like a Maya-human relationship. So in the Silmarillion, of course, we get Melian marrying Thingol, who is a great elf who has been to Valinor, and Melian herself is a pretty substantial Maya on her own. And then they end up having, as a child, Luthien, who seems more powerful than your average elf, and arguably, greater than most of the Noldor in terms of what she can do. And certainly her powers seem to, at least to some degree, derive from her mother, who is a Maya. Now, this seems kind of unlikely on its face too, because the only example that we ever see of a Maya getting involved with one of the children of Iluvatar in that kind of way is Melian and Thingol, and we get the idea that it's a very unique occurrence. She's the only one that does it in the story, and we get the idea that it's pretty unusual that that would happen. Indeed, cross-species, and by species I mean humans and elf, I mean they're not in a sense really different species in a scientific sense because they can interbreed, obviously, but the only cross-type relationships we see are very rare. We get, Beorn and Luthien, we get Tuor and Idril, and we get, maybe a couple more, but that's about it. We get very, very rare instances of that. And in some of Tolkien's later writings, he has characters point out that such things ought to be rare. It shouldn't be the norm because they are two different things with two different general destinies, you might say. So it doesn't really seem to fit his world that a Maya would get involved with a human, because at least with Thingol is immortal and will last as long as the world lasts, apart from being killed, of course, which he eventually is. But, if he's not killed outright or something like that, then his and Melian's relationship can literally last until the end of the Arda. So that at least seems to work a little bit better, whereas it doesn't seem to work very well at all for a Maya to end up marrying a mortal. And one of the things about mortal and and elf relationships that we see is typically what they end up meaning is somebody's got to give up something. And in Luthien's case, of course, that means Luthien ends up becoming mortal herself. And it's kind of a weird thing. Tuor and Idril doesn't seem to give up anything, but Tuor seems to sail into the West and become accepted among elves, or at least that's a hypothesized end for him, which means he has to give up his human heritage. The marriage of elf and man always results in somebody losing something, but how would that work in a Maya-human relationship? So that doesn't seem terribly plausible. So then how do we figure out what Beorn is? Interestingly enough, Tolkien did end up writing a lot of stuff on the origins of orcs much later in his life, and I need to do a video on this at some point, but for now suffice to say that in his later days, he kind of worked away from the idea that orcs were corrupted elves and towards the idea that they were corrupted men. And he even hinted that maybe some of the more formidable orcs and the major captains and whatnot might not have been just humans, but in fact Maya, evil Maiar, that took the form of orcs and, were the greatest warriors in Morgoth's army, short of, the Balrogs and all that stuff. So he came up with this idea that there might actually be Maiar that are acting like more or less mortals, corrupted humans, meaning orcs. And so maybe it is slightly more possible that there are some strange, cases of Maiar interacting with humans, because if you think about it, with this kind of a background for orcs, this might explain why orcs are so different from all the other races. They might actually be the product of Maya human interbreeding and like a weird, terrible genetic experiment on Morgoth's part. And one thing you can say about Morgoth, he was always experimenting with some pretty nasty stuff. And, we can of course see that come down even into the Lord of the Rings, because Saruman ends up doing pretty much the same thing with his Uruk-hai. They are the product of breeding goblin men and half-orcs, and, and you don't want to think about what that means, but the idea there is certainly possible within the Silmarillion context as well. And if it starts with Maiar, then maybe there are other instances out there that Maiar got involved. So maybe as Tolkien's, and this of course was written well after The Hobbit, but it's interesting how Tolkien's later ideas on the origins of orcs might open the door to something more like that for Beorn, because maybe there are other Maiar that got involved with humans, not in a very clean way, let's say, because Melian and Thingol is a much cleaner relationship because they're both immortals. But there might be other Maiar who aren't, let's say, evil on the side of Morgoth, but not necessarily doing what they ought to do in the normal way either, and therefore not perfectly aligned with the Valar either, and going out there and getting involved with humans and doing stuff that ends up leading to something like Beorn and Shapeshifters. And we can even get an idea that maybe this is the case too, because Tolkien, being a Christian or Catholic, would have been probably very familiar with the idea in Genesis of occasions where angels would have interbred with humans, and seemingly that is the cause of there being giants in the world. At least that's one interpretation. What Tolkien's view on that, I don't know, but it's at least a plausible explanation for what he might have been thinking in terms of, how Maiar get involved with humans and the results that might cause. And so it could be that there are some Maiar who are fallen in a sense, but not totally gone to the dark side with Morgoth, who do get involved with humans somewhere else in the world, and thereby end up leading to lines like Beorn's that have inherent magical, if you want to call it magical, abilities that don't really seem to fit with the rest of the world. So to me, this seems to be the best explanation for where Beorn comes from. I can't think of another one that's better. And again, the only other one that really seems terribly plausible is the one where he's just, in some sense, a magician casting spells on himself to change himself, which to me doesn't really seem to fit with the story, but hey, that's just my interpretation. So if anybody else has a theory on this, put it in the comments below, and we'll see if we can come up with a really solid understanding of what's probably going on here. Should be fun. So that's my take on the origins of shapeshifters like Beorn in Tolkien's world. And of course, we do have to remember, when he wrote The Hobbit, he was not planning for that to be part of Middle-earth. So fitting him into the world is not going to be neat and tidy, let's say. But I think it's still kind of important that we can try, because Tolkien does give us enough information that we can do stuff like that, and that's really cool. So, like I said, if you have your own theory, leave it in the comments below. Please do like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to hit that bell icon. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, where I occasionally drop some Tolkien trivia questions. And you can find me on Rumble and support me on Patreon. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.